Thanks, good morning and welcome. I'm very excited we're talking finance. It's such a key topic for this whole area. And we have three presentations to kick us off with for the scene setting. So I'll ask Matt to come up, talk to us about financing blue carbon ecosystems. What are the options, Matt?
Indeed, Finance Day. So a lot of you are sitting there wondering, well, why are they opening the finance session with a science guy? And so there is a backstory, and probably as part of the backstory, a bit of a confession. So going back about 30 years ago, I started studying economics in high school. And I thought, this is a really silly subject. None of it makes any sense. They're just making this stuff up. So I studied biology and geography instead, because that made sense. Photosynthesis, cell division, growth, it all made sense. So everything was going swimmingly until about 10 years or so ago, when I was in a room like this, and there was conversations about seagrass, and then the conversation turned to finance, and I was sort of in the back of the room, not dozing off. And then somebody said measurement, and that woke me up, because I'm a scientist. I like measuring things. Measurement is what I do. And so as I started paying attention, I realised something that Torsten would have told me if I'd bought him a drink earlier, and that is finance is not economics. And it can start to make sense. They're doing real things with real money and measuring real stuff. And so I started paying attention and learning about this and figuring out, well, what is it that we're trying to do, and why is it as a scientist that I need to be thinking about the way that finance people want to measure aspects of blue carbon ecosystems. So here's our starting point for the day, and this is let's say framing of some of the problem. So a lot of you are sitting here as practitioners, and essentially what you want is a way to pay for the things that are good that you want to do. And a lot of it at the moment comes from governments. In fact, most of the finance for working on nature-based solutions, broadly defined, comes from governments. A very small proportion of it comes from the private sector, and a tiny, tiny proportion of it comes from these things that we've been talking about a lot, called carbon markets. Now, markets, there's many options in finance, which I'll get to in a minute. The markets are probably the bit that I've been focusing on. But among all the options, if we put them all together and look at government plus private sector, then we get to the point where we realise, well, actually, we're nowhere near what we need to be. And the gap is large. There's a lot of numbers that are floating around. Various people make various claims. There's I think 200 billion written into the global biodiversity framework, for example. Lots, but the bottom line is, whatever the number is, more is needed, and a lot more is needed. But there are options. This is a piece of work that was done a couple of years ago as an outcome of one of our IORA meetings. And essentially, this one demonstrated, well, there are a lot of options out there. A big part of the problem is explaining what they mean to different practitioners and thinking about which options are appropriate in which contexts. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of these options. I'm going to leave that to people who actually know what they're talking about. So Vida after me and Torsten actually know what they're talking about. I'll just make a few musings over the next few minutes about markets, because markets, they're a really small part of the global finance equation for NBS at the moment, but they could be larger. And markets are probably, to most people in the room, relatively intuitive. You have a willing seller, you have a buyer, you exchange some kind of currency, and then there's an exchange of the good or the service on offer, right? That's pretty simple. Now, of course, if we get into the world of carbon markets, then we're talking about various things. We're talking about vintages and retirements and registries and all sorts of palaver. But fundamentally, it's pretty simple. And some of this simplicity is attractive, but also some of the scaling has been attractive because markets work at a scale that can be appropriate to projects. So markets can work at a scale that can match tens to hundreds or perhaps thousands of hectares, whereas if we're talking about bonds and so on, which we will, right, we're talking about a whole different other scale. And so markets have been growing. But now, here is a pause, and because I'm among friends, I'm going to say, friends, there's a conversation that we have to have, and I don't think we've had it yet. So this idea that I started with is that many of us are here because we're trying to find a way to pay for the things that we want, right? The good things that we want. So the solution, if we go down a market pathway, looks something like this. It's like we take the aspects of nature that we value, we turn them into units, we privatize them, and then we sell them so that they become assets, units, that are then privately held and can be traded, okay? So that takes you down a particular path. Now, there are various reasons why we might want to do that, but then there are also various reasons why we might not want to do that. And those reasons are multiple. So there are perhaps some folk who might take a moral philosophical point of view and say, well, privatising nature isn't particularly comfortable to me. But also, we need to be realising if we're working in different economies and across different geographies and political economies, then sometimes that's not appropriate. So, for example, in some contexts, we might be needing to deal with this concept of halal finance, where some things that are kind of intrinsic to a free market economy might not be acceptable. And in some political contexts, then operating a free market might not be possible at all. So there are contexts in which it is appropriate, contexts in which it's not appropriate, and probably just a stop and a pause as we're getting into it, and just eyes wide open about what it is that we're doing, all right? And then, of course, there's this whole trade-off about carbon with other values, and I think that's been picked up a little bit in the last few days. So also, what I've heard in the last few days are some of the frustrations that people are having as they're trying to implement a market-based approach to financing the work that they do. And there are some barriers, okay? Now, rights can be a problem. So carbon has been a relatively fuzzy concept to understand in many ways, and it hasn't really been embedded in national laws in many cases until recently. And so there's some judicial interpretation of legislation sometimes required, and sometimes whole new laws are being required. Then there's other things that I'll get to. So sometimes we've been saying we need clarity on rights. But again, eyes wide open, because when we do that, sometimes the answer that you get isn't the answer that you wanted. So when we're talking about sovereign nations, remember that those sovereign nations have the right to pass laws, and those laws might be somewhat different than what you'd hoped. So in some cases, if what you're actually interested in is benefit sharing and in funds that go down to local communities, then national laws might actually not necessarily enable that. This is, I just put Mashiat's picture up there because this is not my work. This is work from Mashiat, from Madagascar, who was one of our early career ocean professionals who spent some time in Perth last year analysing the flow of benefits under legislation. Then additionality. So additionality is there for a reason, and it's there for a very good reason. It's because if we're emitting carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and we want to pull them out of the atmosphere or stop putting them in, we need to do that in a way that guarantees it doesn't go back in to the atmosphere, right? So we've got to have some issues around permanence, some questions around additionality. But what the corollary of that is that the good stewards of nature don't necessarily have a particular role in that system, right? So those communities that have been good stewards of their particular systems don't get any particular financial reward under that particular constraint. And then one of the big barriers that folk are facing is this problem that, yes, it's expensive, but many of the expenses come at the front. And if you're hoping to get revenue to pay for the good things, then you need that money up the front. But if the money doesn't come until you've done it and have something to sell, then you're in a bit of a bind, right? So that can be a problem. So I just put this slide up there. I popped it up, popped a similar version up the other day. This is just to remind me to say we've done some modelling on this that plays around on a national level that you can play around, and this works. It's live. You can go on this website and do it yourself. So you play around with various things like how much does it cost to do my project? How much does it cost to set it up? And how much does it cost to maintain my project per hectare per year? And then what price am I going to get, right? So this takes me all the way back to my high school economic days where I had to think again about cost versus price and what that means. So the answer for Australia, at least, is that under current carbon prices, we're not really going to move the dial very much. The current carbon price in Australia sort of hovers around the $30 to $35 a tonne. It's got to be north of $50 a tonne before we can start making a difference, and probably north of $80 a tonne before we really start moving the dial. Carbon plus approaches. Okay, so this one's really fascinated me this year, and I've been quietly amusing myself this week when I hear about market versus non-market approaches and carbon market versus non-carbon market approaches. It reminds me of the taxonomist who proposed that we divide the animal world up into elephants and non-elephants, right? Now, of course, taxonomists need a more versatile taxonomy, which is why we divide the animal world up into all sorts of things. Well, Torsten, I'm sure, will talk about a much more sensible taxonomy for finance. So finance isn't carbon markets versus non-carbon markets. There are many, many instruments, and I think I would encourage us to be more familiar with the vocabulary and not fall into this simple binary taxonomy. Biodiversity credits are a part of that, right? And they're a really big emerging part of it. And I hear lots and lots these days about the potential for biodiversity credits to be stacked or bundled or stapled with carbon credits, right? Now, they provide an opportunity, but they're also emerging and have a few issues. Now, the opportunity is that maybe we can overcome some of these issues that we have with carbon markets. So maybe we can address that question of additionality. Okay, so maybe biodiversity credits really do offer us an opportunity to reward good stewards of the system through designing things a little bit differently. They also offer us an opportunity to rethink this question of permanence. What does permanence mean in a biodiversity context? You know, if we're tracking turtles and following them around, then in a particular place at a particular time, there's no permanence. So we can get permanence if we're talking about some habitats, for example, but permanence doesn't mean anything if we're talking about a particular species composition. All right, so an opportunity to have a conversation about the constraints of carbon markets. How can we design something that's better, more fit for purpose, that does what we want it to do? All right, now, as this is happening, and I think Vida will probably mention this, there's many standards. The integrity is really variable and in some cases isn't there at all. There isn't any governance really in biodiversity crediting at the moment. If you use a different metric, you'll get a different answer. So on the one hand, you can go shopping and buy the credit that suits you best. But on the other hand, you can game the system, all right? And the gaming is happening. All right, so let's watch what we're doing. When we're talking about biodiversity credits, again, just beware that this isn't a simple panacea. It's not going to solve your problems. We're going to have to redesign. Now, things that we can do now, this is mostly things that regulators can do to help build a system that enables what we want better. These are perhaps things, take a photo if you want, ask questions about it later. We've got some conversation. I think how am I going on time, Torsten? Pretty much done. All right, so let's talk about this later, right? I won't step through them one by one. All right, back to you, Torsten. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Matt. And we're going straight on to Vida Fitzsimmons, who is hopefully on the line, from who will talk to us about the demand investor perspective. Vida, can you hear us?
Hello, I can. Can you hear me okay?
Fabulous. And we see your slides, so you're ready to roll.
Wonderful. I'm hoping I'm not an enormous head in the auditorium. Hi, everyone. As I was introduced, I'm Vida Fitzsimmons from Pollination. It's such a pleasure to join you from Wangal land, and I too would like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land that I join from and that we all join from. I think we know that globally 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is stewarded by Indigenous communities. And so in this discussion about nature finance, I think it's so important that what we're really talking about are means to, means to direct finance into the hands of Indigenous communities to continue the work that they've been doing for millennia to steward biodiversity. So as mentioned, I'll be touching on the demand for blue carbon benefits and building upon some of what Matt has already unpacked. Very briefly, I thought it was worth just introducing Pollination. So we're a little bit of an unconventional business. We were founded on the idea that bringing together people of really diverse backgrounds under one roof, we may be able to innovate solutions to some of the really gnarly problems that we're all seeking to solve in the climate and biodiversity space. And so we have engineers and ecologists. I'm a lawyer by training, policymakers, and we all work across advisory, investment and projects to try and address these problems. In the blue carbon space, it's become an area of specialty for us. And so we're involved with the world's largest blue carbon project. It's a 350,000 hectare project in the Sindh province of Pakistan. And we also across Australia, UK and the US have contributed to initiatives to seek to alleviate some of the challenges that Matt was speaking to. We know that blue carbon projects provide this really rich suite of benefits, but we also know that from a financing perspective, they're quite challenging to get off the ground. And so our work has been to try and work with policymakers, the private sector and the environmental NGO space, as well as not-for-profits to really direct finance into projects. Briefly to touch on, Matt has already mentioned this, but thinking about the environmental market space, we're really talking about the unitization of some kind of benefit. And essentially what's being sold is a claim right, a right to say, a particular thing about a particular benefit. And so in the blue carbon space, as I said, we know that they provide this whole suite of benefits. And so as Matt was touching on, carbon has really dominated the environmental market space for a number of reasons to date, but we know that these projects also provide biodiversity, pollution mitigation, coastal resilience, cultural and community benefits, as well as tourism and fisheries benefits. And so as environmental markets are starting to mature, I think some of what we're seeing is consideration of the ways that this broader suite of benefits can potentially be unitized and credited as a standalone unit. The intent, as Matt alluded to, is that in doing so, we'll be able to make projects that currently aren't economically viable from carbon market finance alone, economically viable, and also to have avenues to direct finance to activities that currently aren't eligible for carbon market finance. And so Matt's example of additionality is a really great one, and particularly for Indigenous peoples and local communities, where the carbon market in some instances creates a perverse benefit for those who have destroyed nature in the past, that they can be eligible for carbon finance, whereas countries and regions that have protected standing forests, for example, may not be eligible for carbon finance. And so we can see in the design of this broader suite of environmental markets a real consideration of the ways that markets can be designed to alleviate some of the barriers to finance that have existed in the carbon market space. It's worth noting, though, that not all benefits will be appropriate to be traded in environmental markets as a standalone credit. And so in general terms, for a benefit to be appropriate to be traded in environmental markets, there must be a standard for unitizing the benefit. There needs to be a business rationale for purchasers to buy the credit, and there needs to be a business rationale for a project proponent to go through the exercise of unitization, which of course has costs associated with it. And so thinking about that broad suite of benefits that a blue carbon project is likely to provide, there are some benefits within that set that may be appropriate for unitization and sale through environmental markets, and others that are not necessarily appropriate. And so for carbon, we know that there are existing standards and there is a business rationale for credit purchase. Biodiversity credit markets, which I'll also touch on briefly in a second, there are some methods applicable to the coastal and marine space, and as I'll touch on, a kind of emerging, though still nascent, business rationale for investment in biodiversity credits. Pollution mitigation, there are some methods that are applicable to quasi blue carbon projects at the moment. They're mainly things like the Reef Credit Program, which is obviously upstream and dealing with on-farm activities that have an impact on blue carbon ecosystems. And then coastal resilience, I imagine this may have been touched on in the preceding days, but TNC and its partners are working on a method under Vera that would support the generation of a standalone coastal resilience asset. Though it's worth noting that the business rationale for a purchase of that kind of unit is a little bit fuzzy. I think the demand drivers for biodiversity, pollution mitigation, and coastal resilience credits are at this stage less clear than in the carbon space. Worth just very quickly noting that there are different ways that these credits can be bundled, stacked, or stapled. So the sale of two different types of units together. If you're generating credits on different types of credits on the same piece of land, that's referred to as bundling and stacking. And so there you can have either the two units generated on the same piece of land sold together to a single purchaser or sold to separate purchasers. Or we've also seen examples in market of stapling, whereby credits that are generated on separate pieces of land are sold together as a consolidated unit. It's worth noting that here, because essentially what is being sold is a claim right, the the contracting of the claims that can be made by purchasers become more complex, where you have bundling, stacking and stapling. And I think as we see more of this kind of activity in market, the lawyers amongst us are going to be kept busy making sure that the claims that are being sold and then made by purchasers are aligned with what is being ultimately purchased and contracted. In the carbon market space, I'll speak very briefly to what investors are seeking. I think, as Matt alluded to, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen really increased scrutiny on the integrity of environmental markets. I think this is an incredibly important part of the maturation of carbon markets, and criticism, I think, broadly is helpful for the consolidation of and maturation of the market. I think, though, for the most part, certainly in the Australian context, we have an astounding amount of rigor behind our methods, and though globally these markets aren't perfect, the rigor of the methods and verification for the most part is quite strong. And so there's a balancing exercise in absolutely calling out areas for improvement and projects that are struggling, but also ensuring that the projects that are being successful and aligning with integrity standards, those success stories are also receiving adequate publicity and attention. In terms of what the implications for investors, I think certainly with this increased scrutiny on the integrity of environmental markets overall, there's a huge investor focus on the integrity of the units that they're purchasing, and a real consciousness of not participating in any kind of transactions that could lead to reputational challenges. And so a real focus on the integrity of the units that they're engaging with. That includes the fundamentals of market integrity, like additionality, permanence, no double counting, but also some of the more granular aspects of projects. And so one area that I think we've seen a huge amount of growth in, particularly in the last perhaps 2 to 3 years, is in the expectations around the engagement of Indigenous people and local communities, and a maturation from free, prior and informed consent to equitable benefit sharing, to a more mature view that best practice looks like First Nations communities not just receiving benefits from a project, but really being owners or co-owners of projects and directly materially financially benefiting from projects and being involved in project decisions on lands that they have rights to. In terms of the way that all of this plays out, an investor appetite to pay a premium for the kinds of projects that we know that blue carbon projects and benefits that we know that blue carbon projects are likely to provide, there are different ways that co-benefits can be structured when paired with a carbon credit, and so they vary in terms of rigor. There are unquantified co-benefits, which are assumed by virtue of the nature of the activities being undertaken. So, for example, biodiverse mangrove restoration projects, they can be unquantified or they can be certified, and obviously there's an increase in rigor with the kinds of claims that can be made on the basis of a purchase of that kind of credit, and also an increase in the costs associated with that certification process. I pulled out some quick numbers from the ecosystem marketplace reporting, and we have seen a strong track record of the market valuing credits with co-benefits above credits without co-benefits. And also, for those of us interested in blue carbon, we've seen blue carbon credits trading at a premium to both generic carbon credits without co-benefits and also non-blue carbon credits with co-benefits. And so we can see that the market is responding to the overall profile of blue carbon credits, which is really great to see. It is worth noting that the purchaser's willingness to pay a premium for carbon credits with co-benefits really depends on a range of factors, including the way that the carbon credit will be used within their overall decarbonisation strategy, and in some instances, purchasers take a different approach for credits that will be used and retired for compliance purposes versus those that are used voluntarily. Biodiversity credit markets, Matt touched on these, so I'll whip through these next few slides. As he mentioned, it's a nascent market. We've seen a huge proliferation over the last, particularly perhaps 2.5 years. I think if we were having this discussion a few years ago, this slide would have been empty, but we have been tracking the development of the market, and this is a brief snapshot of the breadth of schemes that have cropped up. I think I would agree with Matt that the market is not perfect, but I think it's important to recognise where the market's at. It's really young, and so most of these schemes are really just at piloting stage, and so from an integrity perspective, there's certainly elements that we would like to see improved and areas that can be strengthened. But given where the market's at, I think it's been encouraging to see that right from the outset, all of the schemes that we have engaged with are really mindful of the integrity elements of carbon markets and some of the criticisms on carbon markets, and are really seeking to ensure that their schemes are doing it better. Whether that is borne out in reality, obviously, we need to wait and see. But I would observe that the intent for integrity to really be at the heart of biodiversity credit markets is there. Very quickly, there's a great diversity across those schemes. Almost all of them take a slightly different approach to the unitisation of biodiversity benefits, which leads to confusion. It will lead to complexity in market function, but is also reflective of where the market is currently at. For the most part, we can see this pattern of approaches. So biodiversity credits broadly reflecting a certain outcome or activity over a specified area for a specified time period. I thought it was worth just really briefly asking for ourselves whether we think that biodiversity credit markets are putting a price on nature. I know that the concept of these markets can make some really uncomfortable, and I think all of us who work in this space are here because we really care about nature, and so there can be discomfort in the idea of that being, to Matt's point, privatised. I think my view is that a way to think about biodiversity credit markets is not so much that it's putting a price on nature, but rather a price on the labour associated with the protection and regeneration of nature. We know, certainly in the blue carbon space, these projects are expensive. They require significant finance, and as to Matt's point, upfront finance. And so biodiversity credit markets may be a way to finance the physical costs of undertaking that work, but not necessarily seeking to put a price on nature itself. I think I'll whip through these. I'm mindful of time, but just wanted to touch on as I said, Pollination has been tracking the development of these markets quite closely. And just on Monday, we published a report that reflects the findings of a survey that we conducted of 16 of the major biodiversity credit schemes globally. And so that report has given some quite interesting insights about the state of the market currently. Overall, half of those 16 schemes have transacted credits. For the most part, that has occurred in the last 2 years, and taking the quantum of credits that they've transacted from a range and a pricing range, we can see that the total value of the market to date ranges from 325,000 to 1.8 million, and that represents the protection and regeneration of 26,000 to 25,000 hectares. In terms of the drivers of demand, multinational corporations, financial institutions, and SMEs were identified as the core sources of demand. And we also asked about the scheme's observations on what was motivating those purchases, and they reported back that they were seeing marketing and brand as the core driver, but really closely followed by risk mitigation. And so globally, there's been a really robust discussion about nature-related risks under the leadership of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which has driven a different understanding within the private sector about the impacts and dependencies on nature and the risks that they give rise to. And so it is quite interesting to see that already nature-related risks is being identified as a core driver for the purchase of biodiversity credits. Very quickly, we have seen that in the survey results, we saw that the schemes are observing a preference from purchasers for biodiversity credits that have a nexus to their footprint, which we thought was a really interesting observation. And certainly for the financing of blue carbon ecosystems, I think is interesting for us to think about. We asked about the ecosystems that their schemes can be applied to, and 56% have methods applicable to coastal ecosystems and 44% to marine ecosystems. In terms of recommendations, I think Matt and I are singing from the same song sheet, and so these are very much aligned. I noticed in your program this afternoon, you're having a discussion about whether the regulatory environment enables nature-based solutions. I think that's an incredibly important part of the role of government, and globally we can see that inadvertently, in some instances, the regulatory regimes create barriers to projects being able to be undertaken in a way that is economically viable. Finally, for private sector folk in the room, I think my prevailing recommendation is that enduring and patient partnerships are really likely to be the key to unlocking blue carbon project potential. I'm sure over the last 2 days there will have been rich discussion about some of the complex elements to blue carbon projects and to the financing that they require. And so I don't think it's going to be the case that you can have a private sector entity merely acting as a purchaser, certainly at this point in the market. And what would be great to see, we've seen some instances of private sector actors really rolling up their sleeves and working with supply side actors to get the kind of projects off the ground that they would like to be the ultimate purchaser for. And so it would be wonderful to see more of that mutual partnership building. Thanks so much. I'll pause there.
Excellent. Thanks, Yuveda. And now I'll give a quick presentation. I actually worked in finance. I spent about 25 years financing all kinds of things. And so I will run through a few themes. I'll start off with what you already heard. This is kind of the narrative in which we live, that there is a blue carbon world, that we can get to values for that, that we can help these projects. So BCAF is one of these examples, that there are these carbon markets, and more specifically the blue ones, and that there are, like here outlined by the international finance corporations, specific approaches to deliver blue carbon finance. Now this, I was asked to talk about latest trends. Anybody who attended this amazing Japanese event yesterday, for me, a great example on how a country, by creating an organized approach through the JB market scheme, adhering to integrity approaches, can come with valuations that make this much more attractive as an invested part. We see similar developments in China on a provincial level. We see in the States, this is last week, specific guidance on how you can list voluntary carbon credit derivatives, so financial transactions on the back of the credits. We see in the corporate space that we now have assessment of their biodiversity impacts and dependencies for all the large global listed companies, where specific companies have high impacts, broad dependencies on ecosystem services. This will transform the way they think about what they do, but more importantly, their investors think about what they do. And to mention just the UK, they are having a consultation now on how to reform exactly that interaction between the voluntary carbon and emerging nature markets. So things are happening, but time out. This is a very specific, very unique, and very weird way of talking about the world. If I start a business and I go to a bank and I say, how would you like to finance it? The bank is not normally saying to me, this sounds like a great idea. We love a project. And you have some future money coming in somewhere, which we give you money for today. That's not what banks do. Banks provide services. They lend against specific things that you already have there. And the biggest market for banks, apart from the services, are around these derivatives. The derivatives markets are much, much larger than the underlying financing market. So a bank would say to you, well, who is that corporate that's doing the work? What is your 20-year track record of making money? What is the security package? So I worked in project finance for a long, long time. It's not a word you would even want to mention there. Project finance came up as a very specific, complex way of dealing with big things, like a new port or a new airport. And that would be something generally government would stand behind. So very complex. Secondly, who are the big pots of money? Institutions. And what is the primary goal for an institution, i.e. an asset owner, i.e. a pension fund, an insurance company, etc.? Their primary focus is asset liability management. They know that they have to pay out certain amounts of money at certain points in the future. By the time Leah retires in 2079, there needs to be an income flow coming in. So they need to manage the money till then. So that's what they are concerned about, the risks and the mismatches. The second and just as big pot of money is families, individuals, a very large pot of money. They are more thinking about risk return. How can I make my money grow? So again, an assessment which is not linked to these projects. So it's only when we get to this new emerging world of impact where we link the risk return, we still want the risk return, but we want it with a purpose. So we're adding a level of complexity. We're not taking anything back. So it was the development finance world that started out on the project finance side. And so we have large institutions that are publicly backed, complex decision making. I worked in one of them and have advised others. For corporates, this is all about where does it sit in their value chain? How do you de-risk your value chain so that you can have sustainable supplies all through the process? Another big player in this context can be the insurance sector as we think about risk transfer, as we think about how we discover the price of avoided loss. This system is now working better. What is that worth to us? Well, buy an insurance contract, they will give you a price on that. And then finally, not to forget, finance is entirely driven by its regulatory context. If a central bank says, the more secure asset, we give you a better capital adequacy rule, that has a huge impact. So regulation is a key point of it. So this is from the financial actors perspective. From the financial performance and formats perspective, I already talked about finance is generally against track record, against physical assets and cash flows, not future possibilities. People invest in asset classes. So traditionally, that means you buy a bond, often a sovereign bond, you buy real estate, or you buy listed shares. That's pretty much all that large institutions were allowed to buy till very recently. The regulator wouldn't let them go further, and they wouldn't want to go further. But then, as we realized that a lot of value is created beyond these individual transactions, we created investable formats that are accessible to these. So real estate moved from you buy a building to you buy a stake in a real estate investment trust. Infrastructure, the same thing. Infrastructure was very much bespoke and complex. Now people buy into pools of infrastructure. That makes it accessible to a much larger group of financiers. So as we think about nature, we need to think about what are these collective vehicles that would allow the large pots of money to come in. And results-based finance is really only now emerging. So figuring out how we link results, because results outcomes matter to the public, so it's often in a public-private partnership context. And I already talked about the large corporates and their interest in value chain resilience, and therefore concepts like nesting, i.e. to make sure that the nature-based solution is part of their system. So if these are the formats, what are the features that finance actors would think about? So they think about in traditional categories in the capital structure. So they think about equity, and junior capital, and senior debt. Where do you sit as a financial player? How does that link to the types of transactions we are talking about? And absolutely crucial, they think about liquidity. What does liquidity mean? It means that any decision I make, I can reverse within seconds, because I can just say on the London Stock Exchange, I love that share, but now I want out. Or I like my cash back, I want out. So having liquid structures that you can exit is absolutely at the core of things. And that's why capital markets are so crucial. And that's why we use price discovery mechanisms, these big liquid markets, or if it's new and complex, we run auctions. We auctioned telecommunications licenses and governments made a lot of money with it. We're doing it with offshore wind licenses. We need to use these financially savvy processes to get to better points. And I already mentioned asset owners. A lot of the entities you will engage with as finance don't own anything. They manage for other people. So their decision-making is entirely constrained by whatever mandate they are given by the people who are the actual owners. I talked about capital allocation. My last point on finances, I put up a few abbreviations because we had lots of them in science yesterday. We have many more on finance. I'm not going to explain them to you because I want you to see that this is a complex world out there that lives in its own framing. All of the ones I've mentioned here link to reporting. And reporting is one of these key things that financial institutions increasingly have to do. So they have increasingly to tell different regulators different things about different parts of their portfolio. Hugely complex and challenging for them, and for that interaction between what the finance actor does and the underlying company does. So that's finance. And now that you know that, take it back to what we're trying to discuss. So how do we get finance into the world we care about? So we wrote this paper for the Ocean Panel, and you will see that I think finance is only 0.5 out of 7 on this long list of things that we need to address. So finance sits in a context, and to get flows, we need to address that context. Blue finance is a narrative that we use to get people to engage with these ocean opportunities. And it's obviously particularly relevant for those companies that have some form of exposure. We wrote these principles to help people invest. But really, I think we need to translate what we talk about into the categories that are seen as investable. So integrating nature-based solutions into the infrastructure investment world is what unleashes large amounts of money. There's 100 trillion that will be spent on infrastructure over the next 20 years. If even a small percentage of that money is spent sensibly, i.e. aware of the risks and changes with climate, and spending on nature-based solutions that are more effective to address that transition, we have a huge win ahead of us. If they spend it in the traditional way of either ignoring these changes and challenges, or by overspending on traditional solutions, the world has a real problem. So it's addressing that's key. Through Aura, we have started to develop a whole range of potential approaches of investment for, in particular, small island states, because a lot of the larger solutions I propose don't fit. They need to be addressed specifically. And so perspectives around this, countries need to engage with robust measures for protecting, restoring blue carbon ecosystems, and coming up with financial formats around it, and again, the Japan example, allows significant fund flows. We already heard an equity perspective, that is, those who contribute to protect the global commons is absolutely crucial. In Baku, the thing to watch is the Article 6 discussion, because that is where we finally will have a detailed playbook that would allow someone like Switzerland, say, or Denmark, or the Danish pension funds, who, by the way, have already spent 50 billion on allocations to the green finance space, to actually account for the additional spending that takes place in other countries. Compliance markets, absolutely crucial. We talk a lot about the voluntary side. I think there's a lot more opportunity in compliance. As soon as you tell a buyer that the only thing he can do if he doesn't manage to get to net zero himself is to buy credit out of a certain pool of approved assets, at that point the price of those approved assets goes through the roof. So absolutely crucial. So I end with these 4 big themes. One is working much more closely about understanding where do the corporate value chains sit, so that you can nest the blue carbon, the blue biodiversity solution into that aspect. Talking about nature-based solutions and blue infrastructure. Talking to financial institutions about their own reporting and transitioning, because they all are now faced with a world where they need to be entirely different, at least in certain regulatory environments. And so for them to understand the space and work with the space is a real opportunity. And then finally, something I keep saying, this is an investable asset class. If I am a large asset owner, like these institutions, I should be saying to myself, what is it that has value in 30, 40, 50 years' time? And at the moment, 0.2% probably of that investable pool is in nature. I would think that that is a misrepresentation of what has value in the future. And so even if they push that up to 5%, we'd have a huge amount of money flowing. So it's really important that we work on these narratives. So thanks very much. And now I think we have a few minutes for discussion to the 3 panelists. So Matt, if you join me here, Vida is still online, and Steve gets the first question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, hello. Right, thank you all very much. I thought about the discussion on biodiversity credits, and I was listening very carefully to the wording. And I guess kind of a word of caution is that we don't, and I didn't hear this happen, that we don't conflate biodiversity credits with biodiversity offsets. And if we want to look at the biodiversity offsets market, a close analogy is the compensatory wetlands mitigation market in the US, which has existed since the 1980s. Now, we saw a price there, it's a regulated system, we saw a price there for the credits of $25. A compensatory mitigation credit in the US would sell for, I said $400,000 per hectare. This week it's about $600,000 per hectare. Now, that sounds fantastic, but
what
it's not.
The question?
So the question, but the point is that market had a very checkered history. And so it only really operates where you have extremely knowledgeable regulatory framework. Without a regulatory framework, you get abuses. Without a knowledgeable regulatory framework, you get abuses. So you need a very strong framework. It's just a note of caution to when you listen to these discussions, make sure there's no sleight of hand in the back there, that it's actually a biodiversity offset that's being talked about and not a credit. So my question is, how do we protect against sleight of hand in the biodiversity credit market?
So, Vida, you are now a giant head on a screen, just as you hoped, and I think you're the right person to answer that one.
Yeah, well, oh, sorry, I'm getting some echo. That's a little bit disconcerting. It's a great question, Steve and Matt. That is very rude to let me know how large my head is. I think it's a wonderful point. Certainly in the way that we conceive of biodiversity credit markets, we are very careful to speak only about voluntary biodiversity credit markets, and the data seeking and analysis that I was speaking to, that's just the voluntary biodiversity credit market. I think the distinction is incredibly important. We've also been testing with the schemes the kinds of claims that they allow to be made on the purchase of their units, and we were interested to see whether they are drawing a distinction to say that purchasers can only make what's referred to as a contribution claim, which would be a claim that the purchase of the biodiversity credit and the finance, the outcomes financed, contribute to the global nature positive goal, but not a claim, an offsetting type claim to say that that purchase negates a negative impact on nature elsewhere. And what was interesting was to see that most schemes reported back that they don't allow offsetting type claims to be made from the purchase of their units. And so I think we are seeing happily quite a nuanced approach being taken by schemes. I think because, as you were alluding to, there's a nervousness about the checkered history of biodiversity offsetting schemes and a keenness to draw a distinction between those schemes and voluntary biodiversity credits.
Next question. Out of the room, maybe. You found one? Yes. Super.
Hi everyone, Olivia Rendon, Plymouth Marine Lab, UK. I thought it was very interesting, several things that were said, but I was just wondering, because I think Torsten, your presentation was very finance heavy, and I don't know if everyone was following. You lost me a couple of times. So maybe I think maybe it would be useful for everyone here. Can you give us an example when you mentioned about nesting blue carbon into corporate value chains? Can you give us a practical example of what that looks like?
So when Danone, large water company, decided to build out their business in Uruguay, they felt that it's really important that the land above where their water comes from is well looked after. They didn't want agricultural runoff to poison their underlying water quality. So they made a transaction with, in this case, an NGO to actually manage it as a conservation space. Now, if you manage it as a conservation space and then think about the benefits that you could add from a carbon, from a biodiversity perspective, it becomes a really interesting transaction. Super. Okay.
Yes. So I want to focus on the fourth point, the nature as an asset. And I want to do that because I'm still struggling with how we parlay some of what you're saying into payments to maintain an asset that is already in good condition, and perhaps somewhere where the threats are not due to anthropogenic threats, but actually due to climate threats. You know, so I'm sort of like trying to match these things up, and I need your guidance. I need you to tell me how that works.
Yeah, and I think this is exactly one of the benefits of that approach. As you think about stewardship, and therefore nature as an asset, and you look about managing threats, you do not have to just apply the traditional carbon methodology. Here's the degradation, that's the rest. No, you put it across that asset. And so that was the discussion that we had with the Seychelles, the seagrass investment pool. That's the discussion we have the Mediterranean about their seagrass beds, etc., which is to say that you have a financial entity that becomes accessible because it's large enough, it's financeable, that can interact with buyers and sellers, and you have an underlying management which addresses these challenges. And so that focuses on using the finance flows that arrive on top into dealing with whatever the specific issues are, whether they are proactive restoration or whether they are other challenges that need monitoring and finance. And it's that approach that allows you to bring the larger money in and still maintain all the intricate relationships at the local level. You don't have to move something and change the property rights structure or all those issues. So you have a financial, one of the examples I like to use is to think of, say, the art market. So the art market was something for art connoisseurs till investors came along. And now they own a lot of the stuff. But it's not because the Picasso pays out as service. It's because it's an asset that isn't going to be replicated because Picasso ain't going to paint many more. And so the value of the Picasso does not sit in, oh, there are 10 people coming to the museum, all pay $10 entry fee. The value of the Picasso is the scarcity of the Picasso and that buyer-seller relationship. And so creating these pools around nature, marine ecosystems, etc., will allow us to give these large institutional investors a chance to bring money into the space because they get a piece of paper against it that is set properly in a regulatory context. But that money then allows us to actually do all the activities that we feel are necessary to maintain and potentially improve that system. Tom and Leah.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation as well. They were wonderful. Loads of questions, but on that point of scarcity, one of the things that we've come up against a few times is a point that Vida made around how there's a kind of perverse incentive in a market that actually, if you are doing a good job, you're a good custodian of an asset or the environment, actually you're better off demonstrating there's a threat than continuing that action. I wonder if there's any kind of concrete examples you could share of instruments or approaches that sort of try to reconcile that.
Yeah, and I think this is exactly what this big shift would deliver. Because I think the challenge we've had is we developed a particular financial system essentially 10 years ago based on what we were able to do then. And we are now at a point where we need this really much more fundamental shift. And so that's why it's so challenging, because at the moment we're still in this world where we build project to project, and it's this sort of uphill battle, because you need to find a way to pay for it. You need a seller, an investor, but that investor seller has nobody to sell, invest to. So it's a really complex finance challenge. Whereas if we turn this around, and if we manage to convince these pension funds that I'm talking to and others that their present allocation to companies that are destroying the world, not going to be long-term viable, is inefficient for themselves. That's not the right way they should think about the world. They should think about, at least from an insurance perspective, to have the optionality of doing the right thing long-term. And so they come into the market saying, look, here are huge amounts of money we want to allocate into this space. And how can you give us product that delivers on that stewardship and that addresses the wrong incentives side of it? Because it is obviously often significantly cheaper to conserve than to do very intricate activities around it. And so dealing with threats, and I thought, Kath's point, it's not just threats today, it's changes in the system that need active responses. So bringing that in, I think we're at a really crucial transition moment. And I think what I'm trying to say is, as you have impact, your impact will improve if you're able to speak the language of that world out there, and feel free to go broad. It's not just, we need the projects as examples, but we need the bigger narrative to actually do the engagement with the finance world. Leah?
I can also, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I can add a little bit on that question from a biodiversity credit markets perspective. I think it's a really great point. And as I said, it's been interesting and encouraging to see that biodiversity credit schemes are very mindful of the challenges to carbon finance to date. And so it has been encouraging to see that some schemes are gearing themselves to allow the generation of credits for stewardship and adaptation activities. And certainly we know that in many parts of the world, in the context of climate change, even areas that are currently intact and protected may be under increased threats. And so having mechanisms for financing activities to improve the resilience of those ecosystems is incredibly important, and means that we've done some thinking about additionality requirements for different forms of credits. And certainly it's important that we take a critical look at additionality, because we know that even in areas of that are protected under national regulation, we have seen ecosystem decline in those areas. And so we need to take a bit of a more nuanced view to additionality than just saying it's protected, therefore it's not eligible for carbon finance and it's not eligible for biodiversity credit finance. And we are seeing that, which is encouraging.
Super, thanks. And Leah will be the last question. Oh, sorry. Leah and you will be the last question, because then Matt has the second part of our session.
Yeah, my question has changed as this discussion is continued, because there have been so many things to build off. But yeah, I guess my point, talk you said it quite clearly about this thing, and I'm not sure what's going on here. The idea of language and articulation, and I learned a lot from what you were saying regarding how investors and the kind of very much the demand side look at risk and articulate risk, and everyone's looking to make money, and that's what's driving this market, which is good because it's a potential flow of finance. But I think it's more, I guess, kind of like a call to action, or if we could try and articulate as well the risk that people at the other end of the kind of the delivery chain, particularly the kind of the communities that are involved, the risk that they take on, articulating that and ensuring that that is somehow or another built into the, I guess, the value proposition, or how we're talking about these things. Because what I've seen in my experience of this market so far is these, you're seeing these low numbers reported on the, on the ecosystem marketplace, et cetera, but I know that that's the first amount that is maybe paid to the project developer, and then there are many groups that are selling on these credits for numbers far exceeding that, and then the people that are kind of initially invested in the project don't get that money. So how can we articulate the changes, how that value moves through the chain, who's really making the money, and ensuring that the risk is factored into this market that are kind of taken on by communities that are involved and project developers at the, I don't really, but the artist thing was interesting, because I think Picasso died quite poor. And now people are making quite a lot of money from selling on his art. So yeah, exactly. Thinking about that.
Super. And I think the lady there had a question. Did you want to come in? Super.
Thank you. You were talking about the regulatory frameworks within which institutional investors have to operate. And in Australia, like in most other jurisdictions, superannuation funds are subject to quite stringent legislative obligations, which are designed to maintain the stability of the fund and minimise risk exposure, which doesn't sit very neatly with the kind of work we're doing, which is higher risk, longer returns, all of that kind of stuff. Governments are clearly not going to change regulatory frameworks to expose those funds to more risks. So what sort of strategies can they deploy so that they maintain compliance with that framework, but they're able to take some degree of risk and invest in the kind of work that we're all doing and promoting?
No, that's an excellent question, and takes me back to 20 plus years ago when I worked with the superannuation funds investing in telecommunications infrastructure. And it was the Australian superannuation funds and to some degree the Canadian pension funds who were actually trailblazers in coming into this space. And I said to them, are you aware that this isn't just traditional infrastructure, there's a technology risk in the kinds of equipment? And they said, oh, that's fine. So the freedom that your superannuation funds had around the technology risk issue was actually quite remarkable for me to see. And I think having that discussion with them and the regulators about the nature risk component, which in my mind, yes, there is a risk, but it's the opposite. You are increasing resilience by adding these components into infrastructure assessments. So I think this is a huge opportunity for Australia to actually be ahead of the curve compared to investors in some other places. And I would really encourage having that dialogue because it's a large pot of money, and the Australian investor through these funds can play an important role internationally. Thank you very much. Over to Matt for the next half of the session.
Thanks, Torsten, and thanks, Vida. It's always an immense pleasure to be working with people who really do know what they're talking about when it comes to finance. I always learn so much from both of you. Bosses at the back of the room, how are we going with timing? We're sliding just a little bit, but we can go till 11:10, all right. Because otherwise, I was going to pull the old, well, I was at an IORA meeting a couple of years ago, and everyone was given 15 minutes to speak, and of course everyone spoke more than 15 minutes, and I was up next. And the session was being moderated by an admiral, and the admiral said to me as he introduced me, if you can't say what you have to say in 3 minutes, you shouldn't be here. So, all right. That said, I'm not going to do that because we've been given a little extra time. All right, so Lauren Babic from CI. There you are. Hello, Lauren. We talked a little bit about integrity just now, so it seems like a really good follow-up.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren. I'm the Director of Capacity and Partnerships for the International Blue Carbon Institute. For those who aren't familiar with the Institute, we're part of Conservation International, based in Singapore, but with a global remit on scaling up blue carbon policy, finance, and science. So I'm going to be giving a couple of updates on behalf of CI more broadly on high-quality blue carbon principles, as well as some work we're doing in the finance space. So, as a few other speakers mentioned, I can't take credit for this work. This is very much colleagues' work. So first of all, just a quick update on the IPBC principles. So this is a collaborative effort between CI, the Nature Conservancy, AURA, Friends of Ocean Action at the World Economic Forum, and Salesforce. So these were first introduced at COP27 with the overall aim to introduce a pathway for all blue carbon projects to achieve high quality and even more so to incentivize high quality through increasing early stage funding access, long-term project success, and lowering reputational risk for investors. So how does it aim to achieve this? High quality provides credibility that is crucial for investor confidence and can also help foster more ongoing dialogue and lessons learned with the project developers. But likewise, it helps project managers with support in addressing issues like land tenure and legal processes, working with local governments and communities, and ensuring access to long-term sustainable funding. So overall, this helps to drive a shift towards a more equitable blue carbon market for both the suppliers and the buyers. So there are 5 key principles that guide this process: safeguarding nature, empowering people, employing the best information and interventions, operating locally and contextually, and mobilizing high integrity capital. So by using these principles as guideposts, we are able to ensure that these projects are optimizing outcomes for people, nature, and for climate. So following the launch, we did a bit of a process of gathering feedback from some of the early adopters of the principles. And that process really emphasized to us that there's a need for more practical tools, case studies, and capacity building. So this feedback has led to the development of a couple of sort of supplementary tools, one of which is the practitioner's guide and one of which is the recovery wheel. Okay, so the practitioner's guide is something that we're preparing now. I think it might have been launched at New York Climate Week, but I'm not entirely sure if that was the plan at least, but it should be downloadable shortly. But essentially, this is meant to sort of act as a central resource for any practitioner. So when we say practitioner, we don't just mean project developers, but we also mean investors, buyers, NGOs, and governments. And the intent is to support in project design and implementation, as well as adaptive management decisions, help projects align with national management strategies, so national policies like NDCs, create a shared language and understanding, particularly between the project development side and the investment side, a link to best-in-class resources, and also accessing case studies that demonstrate the principles in practice. The recovery wheel has been adapted by the Society for Ecological Restoration Recovery Wheel, and really this is meant to be a bit of a visual framework to help assess project performance over time and against the principles. So the value of this is it's not time or effort intensive to use. It helps to reduce the reporting and communication burden. It helps facilitate investor decision-making and supports adaptive management decisions and helps to sort of draw out funding and support, capacity support needs. So next steps, these should have both been launched at New York Climate Week and they'll be available to download online shortly. Yeah, so I'll move on to my next update, which is a little bit more relevant to the finance piece. So we're developing a policy primer on financing blue carbon through carbon and non-carbon market approaches with RARE, so with Lisa, who's here with us this week. So I'd just like to use the opportunity to highlight some of the key messages, but also to emphasize this is very much still under development and we want your engagement and your feedback. So if any of this is of interest to you, if you have comments or questions, please find myself or Lisa in one of the breaks. So we know that we need to triple finance for nature-based solutions by 2030 to broadly achieve our climate goals, and that for coastal blue carbon projects, financing approaches can vary greatly. This primer really intends to demonstrate the variety of financing options, especially beyond carbon markets. So what is a non-carbon market approach? There's actually no formally agreed definition, but for the purposes of this primer, we're defining it as any approach that does not include the transfer or trade of carbon. So basically carbon credits from one party to another. They can still involve trading on markets, just not carbon markets. So for example, a carbon sequestration project might also yield sellable outcomes, so a mangrove project that yields sustainable harvesting of shellfish and enabling them to enter an international market is still a market approach, but there's no trade of the carbon. So emerging markets for nature, biodiversity, and resilient credits by this definition are also classified as non-market approaches. So just really quickly, I wanted to highlight some of the examples that the primer will go through, but there's a more exhaustive list in the actual document. But things like payments for ecosystem services, so paying landowners for forest protection or reforestation, such as is the case in Costa Rica. Results-based payments, so a really good example is Indonesia's Palu Net Sync 2030 target, where some of the efforts are partly financed through results-based payments from Norway. And then debt for nature swaps. So a good example is July this year, the government of Indonesia announced a deal brokered by CI with the US to redirect $35 million of its debt towards the US to coral reefs conservation. So I'll leave it here. So this is just a bit of an overview of the sort of topics the primer will address, but we definitely want input, feedback, case studies and examples to include. So definitely if there's any questions, please find me or Lisa at one of the breaks. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Lauren. So as per previous models, we're going to run through our speakers and then have the collective discussion at the end. And so, Lucy and Brian, talking about something that's very close by, in fact, something that I think everyone passed through. All right.
First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this part of the country, the Gimoy and Dingi people and the Yurrakanji people. My name's Brian Singleton. I work for a new organisation called Mangrove Solutions, but I've worked with the Cairns Airport and the Yurrakanji Land and Sea Program. And as part of the Yurrakanji Land and Sea Program, we did a lot of work with the Cairns Airport, and mainly around the mangrove systems. And so when we started to look at blue carbon, we didn't really understand what blue carbon was, but we spoke to Cairns Airport about, what does blue carbon look like? They started to look what was out there and started talking with Deakin. And one of the things that we wanted to do as a ranger program is not just be part or get invited or be asked to support some sort of program. We wanted to be part of it. We wanted to be, we want to know what blue carbon was. We want to know about the research, and we want to start talking to the people that was doing it. So through Cairns Airport, through the Yurrakanji Land and Sea, and through Deakin, we had plenty of meetings, a lot of meetings on Zoom, got to know each other, and then we started looking at a project up here in Cairns at the Cairns Airport. We worked with Deakin. They was going to come up. One of the things that around those projects is that our mangrove systems are pretty big, and I guess I don't know where everyone comes from, but you might have big mangrove systems too. With our mangrove systems, they are pretty well untouched. It was really the rangers that have done a lot of work in those mangroves, so it was sort of wanting to know what those, what Deakin would need. So we would go out and do the surveys first and walk through the mangroves, find the right areas. And, I think that's, for us as a ranger program, was really our taste in what, not just research, but what blue carbon could look like, and start to get a bit of understanding. I guess one of the things that we look at as an Indigenous ranger program, or as traditional owners, a lot of our mangrove systems are across Northern Australia. And I think, that conversation where we didn't really know what blue carbon was, it's a conversation that we wanted to get involved in, and we was lucky that we had an organisation like the Cairns Airport that we had a long-term partnership with. I think it's really important that a lot of traditional owners across Northern Australia is brought into this conversation, because that's where, like I said, a lot of the mangrove systems are up in northern. And I mean, there's mangroves right around Australia, but we're talking about mangrove systems with really deep mud. And the work that we do out there, we do know the mud is around 10 to 12 metres in some areas, but that's the areas that we've worked in. So I'll hand it across to. I won't hand it across to Lucy just yet. That's the map of Cairns Airport, and you can see most of the land is mangrove. The Cairns Airport is a very small section. The areas that we worked in was on the outside. It's about 350 hectares of mangrove, both on where the airport and on the northern side of the Barron River. And one of the reasons we did want to be involved is a lot of these areas are very special to our people. We've got sites in those areas that we want to take people in, and especially researchers in, and introduce them to country first. And so, out of respect for our ancestors, we didn't want people just going in and walking through that part of the country. And we do have a lot, I guess, things that we've got to consider when we do take people in, because we do have mosquitoes and sandflies, snakes and spiders and wasps and crocodiles and things like that that we've got to worry about. So it's important that if we're taking people in, we want them to be safe and we want to bring them out. But it's a beautiful mangrove system, and the blue carbon project we did jointly with Airport and with Deakin, and now we're at the stage where we're just learning about the results, and we don't really understand the credit side. And so, you know, this is our story, or our journey is not over. We've still got a lot of work to do with Deakin and with the Cairns Airport. I'll hand it across to Lucy.
So we are taking you all out to the mangroves tomorrow, so don't let that list of sandflies and crocodiles and mosquitoes deter you. Hi everyone, my name is Lucy Friend. I'm the Environment Manager for Cairns Airport, so I've been there 10 years and I'm from Cairns. And we wanted to start with that introduction from Brian because it is really important for the context of this project. When Brian did come to us and you know, share with us the importance of blue carbon, we thought, okay, well, what would a project look like for us in this area and how do we fund it? So to talk about what the project looked like, this thing. So we did partner with Deakin University's Blue Carbon Lab, and at the time it was Dalwurru Aboriginal Corporation, which, you know, Brian led the team there. And we took core samples across that mangrove area to look at the carbon in the mud. We also did above ground and below ground biomass. And we ended up with the number of about 2,000 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year in terms of sequestration. So Deakin University's lab is, they're going to be publishing the study. We've got the report on our website and we can talk about it tomorrow at the site visit if anyone wants to go into details. But, you know, for the financing part of things, so the project cost about $150,000 for the research, and that was, you know, the monetary contribution that the airport made, but then it also cost us a fair bit of time. So to convince Airport, which is a private company, and definitely in that private kind of sector, it's mostly owned by JP Morgan at the moment. So to convince them that this is a good idea, we kind of had to look at how it fits into our overall environment strategy. And it ends up coming under a sustainability linked loan that we have with our lenders. So that's the mechanism that we've used, which is a bit of a, you know, I'm definitely not a finance person, so I'll keep it brief. But essentially, when we were refinancing the airport with the lenders, with all the major banks, so Commonwealth, NAB, Westpac, ANZ, there was an opportunity for us to link our sustainability performance with our finance. So how that works is if we meet the targets, am I getting this right with the financy stuff? If we meet the targets, then we get a discount on our interest rate. And if we do not meet the targets, this is every year, if we don't meet the targets, then we get the same amount in a penalty. So we're year 2 and it's going well so far. But what we've been able to do with that extra funding is to increase our net zero targets. So we were planning on buying offsets, but we thought instead, you know, with that extra focus, we can invest in research and invest in on-site carbon offsetting. We're not selling credits. We're not, you know, we're not in that market at all. They don't need to be ACCUs for our purposes. But with the scientific research behind that, yeah, our owners and investors were happy with that kind of agreement. And it ends up being a fair bit more expensive, so I don't feel like we got out of anything really. So the financial support definitely helped fund that, and also the loan has been really useful in getting that high-level buy-in. So it's not just a target that we have and it sits there, and if we don't meet it, it doesn't matter anymore. We've got a lot of structure and everyone's looking at it. So it has been really good to make sure we are meeting those targets. And it's by no means restricted to airports. Any company that borrows money from lenders, have these opportunities. So we've had a lot of interest from a lot of banks around the world, other airports, other companies to look at similar structures. So it is just an example that we wanted to share of how we, not relying on government money or anything like that, as a private sector, we have been able to finance that internally and use it to meet our internal targets to make that make sense. I think we're doing questions at the end, so I'll leave that there, and thank you very much.
Yeah, cool. So final plug then, now that you've heard about the mangroves at the Cairns Airport, you've got the Jack Barnes Bicentennial Boardwalk tomorrow. Any spots left, and you too can be part of the sandflies and the mosquitoes and the snakes and spiders and crocodiles. This is cool. So we've done markets and we've learned all about assets of various things, and now loans. Now to tell us about something else to supplement our buffet. No, I forgot my piece of paper, but that's okay, because I know it's Diane and we're going to talk about insurance. Hey Diane, come on up, please.
Okay, so thank you, Matt. I'm Diane Figueroa. I'm from RARE. I'm currently managing our Asia Pacific portfolio. So like some of the speakers, I think that was yesterday, they were trying to do a disclaimer that they are not scientists. I'd like to do something similar now, but I'd like to consider myself as a recovering scientist. So I had a bachelor's and master's degree in science, but I spent almost 2 decades in the finance sector. But I'm happy that with my current role, I have the opportunity to actually blend both worlds. As Matt mentioned, the discussions on science and finance has increasingly become more interconnected. So I've spoke to some of you 2 days ago, and there is really an increased interest in how insurance mechanisms can actually help in financing blue carbon. And I'm happy to share some of RARE's experience now on how we try to explore insurance with a particular insurance class called parametric insurance as I think one of the, maybe a key component to financing blue carbon. So I'd like to start with this image. This is actually a mangrove forest boardwalk in one of our project sites in the Philippines. It's in Del Carmen, Siargao Island. So for some of you who have been to Siargao, or for those of you who have not been there, I highly recommend that you do so. They're known for their world-class surfing spots, and they're also very well known for their wonderful, beautiful mangrove forest. So the picture on the left actually depicts the mangrove boardwalk before Typhoon Odette. We call it locally Typhoon Odette, but internationally it's called Typhoon Rai in 2021. So, and of course the picture on the right is the aftermath. And of course the government, local government, we have a very close relationship with the municipal mayor. They've spent millions in trying to manage and protect this mangrove forest, and of course all of that investment have been wasted in just one singular extreme weather event. So if you're a mayor of that municipality and your constituents are grappling for they're desperate for food, homes are broken, you're grappling as a mayor to restore electricity and water, would you even consider, or worse, would you even cross your mind to allocate some of your budget to restoring this mangrove forest when all the basic and the basic life-sustaining like services are still in crisis? And if you take on the investor's hat, would you be willing to invest in a blue carbon project in Siargao, knowing that, they have absolute no question about their biodiversity potential, but we also know that they're very vulnerable to typhoons, not just the province, but actually the country in general. So your investments can actually be washed away in the next typhoon. So that's where insurance can come into play. I'm pretty sure that most of us in this room, we have purchased some form of insurance, car, fire insurance, health insurance. And I think the reason why we have this is really simple, because we want, for in an event of unexpected events, we do not really want to, like, we want protection. We want protection. We do not want to have out-of-pocket expenses for car damage after an accident, or when we do not want to be faced with massive medical bills on our own. So yeah, the same principle applies to insurance for ecosystems. So essentially, we are trying to transfer the financial burden from the government, from the businesses and investors to insurance providers. But of course, here's the thing, insurance, it doesn't just have to pay for the losses. Speed also matters. So for insurance must have quick payouts. Because after a typhoon, communities and ecosystems, they need immediate help so that they can recover and build back better. So if it takes months for insurance payouts to be processed, then recovery will really be very difficult. So I think that's where parametric insurance can come into play. We are mostly familiar with the indemnity type of insurance. So that's where our fire and car insurance are categorized in. So we'd like to take a quick look at parametric insurance by comparing it with indemnity insurance. So in terms of payout trigger, we know that the indemnity insurance is based on actual assessment of damage. So it means that a person, usually they call it in the insurance parlance, they call it an insurance adjuster, has to physically inspect the place to assess the damage and verify the loss. And this process takes weeks. And if you're in the Philippines, and if you're lucky to be located in a very remote coastal community, it will take months before an insurance adjuster will reach your area. And by that time, if you purchase a boat insurance, you would have suffered massive or significant income losses because you do not have the boat to use for fishing. So parametric insurance, on the other hand, operates in a very different model. The payout is actually based on predefined parameters, thus the word parametric. So the more common parameters now are actually weather. So for instance, wind speed or rainfall. And payout process is very automated. So once a weather parameter threshold is breached, then payout is automatically triggered, and usually within days. So that gives the ecosystem and the community like enough time, time to recover. Now, let's delve into, I prepared two examples from RARE. So first example is actually parametric insurance focused on restoring ecosystems. So the payout trigger for this is, again, weather events. So based on predefined parameters, could be wind speed or storm surges. So when the weather thresholds are reached, then a payout is triggered, and this could be distributed, or this could be given to perhaps an institution or whoever is designated to manage that particular coral, that particular ecosystem. So the funds are immediately released so that restoration can take place. And the project is located in Siargao Islands, the one I flashed out earlier in the Philippines. But this is part of a larger initiative comprising of 3 other countries in the region. So that's Indonesia, Solomon Islands, and of course, Fiji. Of course, we are not just, the project is not just about designing parametric insurance products. There are other important components to it. So of course, we have to do a lot of disaster and climate risk assessments so that we will understand what sort of weather and other types of risk are affecting that ecosystem. We have to do some sort of evaluation of the socio-economic and environmental assessments. We want to understand how the communities are actually relying on the ecosystems for their livelihood, for instance, fishing or tourism. We need to understand, so this is a parametric insurance product, but policy is very important. I've heard a lot of speakers saying that there has to be an enabling environment. So part of the project also looks into the legal governance and policy enabling environment for this particular product to actually be implemented in a particular country. And so that's the first one. That's focused on ecosystem restoration. But the other one is really insurance for fisher income loss protection. So as much as we want to help the ecosystem recover, we should also take into account the financial resilience of, I think, someone mentioned stewards of nature. So the payout trigger for this is bad weather days and particularly high rainfall, wind speed, and wave height. And these three weather parameters are very relevant to small-scale fishers who operate on small boats, who fish using visual cues. So whenever the levels of these weather conditions are breached, it could really be unsafe for these small-scale fishers to go out fishing. And this is very important because we don't want our fishers to suffer financial losses in the event of bad weather. And we're not talking about extreme weather events, it's just bad weather. So, and then of course, because we want to make sure that they have the ability to recover and that they would not resort into non-sustainable practices like overfishing or damaging the marine ecosystems. So currently this is being implemented in 4 provinces in the Philippines. And again, it's not just about the design of the product. There are many components to it. Actually, this project came in 2 phases. The first phase is really on feasibility. We want to make sure that the product is technically feasible. So we did a lot of regulatory analysis. We had weather index to base the payouts on. We have proposed a structure. Who should be the policyholder? Who's going to pay for the cost of insurance? How much is the premium and how much is the insurance coverage? And other strategies to place the insurance in the market. And of course, we are now in the pilot implementation stage. One major component of it is really securing funds to cover the cost of premium. So what we noticed, what's common in most funders for this project, they're willing to fund for product development, willing to fund for other project activities like increasing the awareness or developing the capacity of the national and local governments, but they do not provide funding for the premium. So that's something that we really focus on in our project. In this case, our partner is the Ministry for Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. So the government, for now, because we're in the pilot stage, is subsidizing the cost. Because, of course, for the fishers, there is still low willingness to pay because they're not really much aware of the product yet. But once we have developed a proof of concept, then the strategy for this is for the fishers themselves to really shoulder the cost of insurance. I think I'd like to end my presentation with this new, it's not new, but it's a concept that we are currently working on. So somehow to tickle your interest in potential collaboration. Tolsten mentioned earlier about collective vehicles. So we are actually looking into developing like risk pool for insurance and nature-based solutions. So risk pooling essentially means that we're trying to pool funds from different sources, NGOs, multilaterals. And what's good about this is we are trying to take an integrative approach. So traditionally, the strategies are tackled separately. So risk transfer is one, and risk reduction is another one. But in this solution, we're trying to integrate, and we are trying to see that if we can allocate a portion of the risk pool funds to nature-based solutions, including blue carbon projects. So maybe some sort of proposed outcomes for the IPBC meeting. Maybe we could, as a group, really start to like collaborate on fleshing this idea and to come up with something similar for blue carbon. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you to everyone. Now, if I'm to meet my KPI of releasing you for your cafe and gâteau in 10 past, we have 17 minutes. So if you are willing, I would like to invite Lauren, Brian, Lucy and Diane just join me, and we can circulate microphones and open the floor for discussion. We've covered a lot of ground, including this morning everything that Torsten went through, all the way through from markets and loans and insurance. Ben, take it away.
Thank you. I guess before I start, I didn't really introduce myself to the group ever, so my name is Ben, and I work at Charles Darwin University and AIMS, Australian Institute of Marine Science, and Blue Forests in Indonesia, and the World Bank in Indonesia. My question's a little one, but I think interesting for Lucy and Brian, and maybe others in the room who might have a response. But the day before this conference, I visited Machen's Beach next door, and with a steward who's helping with restoration there, and saw that some of the results of the floods from Cyclone Jasper, sediment, maybe probably the flooding itself, and some debris had killed a decent amount of mangroves, which are recovering. But I'm wondering if Jasper also impacted the mangroves at the airport, and specifically, like, if related to finance, is that considered force majeure if mangroves are dying within a project time frame and you don't get penalized for poor performance because of this flooding event, or how that might be written into a contract with that you described with your with the bank, the banks that finance you. Thanks.
I'll talk a little bit about the mangroves. We was pretty lucky with the mangroves. We did get along the Barron River a lot of the erosion, not a lot, but a lot of the coastal mangroves along the river, was affected. Some of them have fallen down. Just recently we went up for a look, and what we're seeing is some diebacks. So there's a lot of spots along the Barron that's stressing out, and we haven't got to those areas yet. But with the airport itself, the mangrove systems around the airport held up really well, especially between the airport and the coastal. We always get coastal damage through storms, and the mangroves do come back. Sometimes it takes a lot longer to recover, just depending what type of year we've had. But the mud itself has been really stable. We haven't had big wash-off of mud. What we do have is a lot of sediments from up the river, and that have come across and have settled along the coastal part of the river onto the mud.
I always get the fun part. So with the agreement, So the KPI for that is that we do have a net zero target, and so most of meeting that target is by investing in renewable energy and other things, and eliminating emissions. The emissions we can't eliminate right now because it's a net zero by 2025, so next year. It's a short-term thing. So the emissions, Scope 1 emissions that we can't eliminate, that's what we're offsetting through this program. And we do have a lot more mangroves than we need for that. But if they did die from a natural event like that, we would have to purchase offsets to still meet that target. So we have that flexibility, but the second part of the agreement is that our biodiversity target, where it's around habitat management for threatened species. That's also part of the sustainability linked loan. There's 3 parts. So if we do lose the habitat through that, and if we are unable to repair anything, and if it is in our control but it's expensive, that's not good enough. If it's out of our control, then we have the option to be able to purchase similar habitat enhancements somewhere else.
June?
We've got a bit of a line-up.
Hi, thanks for the great presentations. A follow-on question to Lucy and Brian. So I may have missed this, but the loan you took out was with an Australian bank, or is this something that like other countries could take loans out from like ADB or World Bank for projects and then do sort of a similar approach, get a lower interest rate by conserving mangrove forests? It's actually a couple-part question. There's that question, and then my other question is, what do the banks get out of it by conserving that? And then the third question is, and I think you sort of partially answered this with Ben's question, but how do you monitor it? So I know you said it's over in 2025, but like annually, are you using remote sensing to monitor the health of the forest, or how do you monitor that you've succeeded in meeting the target to get that reduced interest rate?
I'll try and remember all of those questions. So the first one, so I think the refinancing process was open to all of the major banks. So we ended up with Commonwealth Bank, ANZ, Westpac and NAB. So there were the 4 that participated. That's going to be different for every company. Who they borrow money from is their agreement. But we ended up with those 4. So that's the first. And it's not, I think any bank can do it. We've had interest from banks in China who've contacted and asked about how this is working, because they're interested in doing something similar. And Commonwealth Bank is actually presenting on this project at the Nature Forum I think it's in Sydney next week. So I know the banks are really looking at this, and they are using it a lot for their reputation as well. So that's one of the things that they get out of it. They get to go and present at cool conferences with pretty pictures, and I think it is a lot about their reputation. And they've got duty of care and things like that as well. So people are expecting more from banks. So that's all part of it. The last question on monitoring. So we were very specific with the KPIs, and every sustainability linked loan agreement will be individual. So it's not something we could just get off the shelf and run with it. We had about 6 months where we were going back and forward with the lenders, looking at exactly what those deliverables will be. And no one's done it before. The banks aren't interested in having these agreements with things that have been done. They want something new. They want beyond business as usual is the terminology that they use. So it is all unique, and it is supposed to be difficult. Otherwise, they're not that interested. So the way that we set up this part, so I said there was 3 parts. So the net zero target, our biodiversity threatened species target, and an Indigenous engagement target. That's the 3. So the blue carbon part of it is we are... the KPI for that is that we have our emissions and we've got that verified, and then we are net zero with the offsets. So the work done by the Blue Carbon Lab to verify that is enough for them. So as long as we're protecting that blue carbon bank area that we've identified, and we engage with the Irukandji Rangers to maintain that as a healthy ecosystem, then that's seen as being net zero for the purpose of the banks.
Deferring to the floor moderator, who was... Jin.
Hi, my name's Jin from Conservation International Australia, and I have a question for Diane about the parametric insurance. I'm just wondering how the scheme accounts for the fact that those weather-related disasters are likely to become more frequent into the future, and I'm thinking with regards to seagrass in particular, flooding events and heatwave events. Does that just mean that the premium continues to go up and up and up? And is there a point at which it's expected that this will just become economically unviable?
Yeah, I actually had the same question when we were trying to, we were starting with parametric insurance. So definitely you're saying that if you know already that that particular country or location is vulnerable and it's visited by like 100 typhoons every year, so why would you even bother to offer insurance as a potential solution? But I guess I think it's all in the model of the insurance. So they actually work and they have a portfolio of clients. So the risk is actually distributed. So it's not just nature-based insurance that are in play. They have also other revenue generating insurance portfolio, like the big classes like marine insurance or others. So they are being able, with a lot of analytics, they are able to come to the point where they can still manage to achieve profitability despite the occurrence of the occurrence of weather disturbances. And of course, with the increase in the weather disturbances, it's highly unlikely, at least historically, that all the project sites enrolled in a particular insurance program will experience the disaster at one time. So some will experience, others may not. So there is also there is still profitability for the insurance companies on this.
All right.
Hi, thank you. For Diane again. I think it's excellent that you're already just going ahead and testing it, because I just think that it's been talked about a lot and we just need to pilot it and see, how, irrespective of outcome, we just need to see how it works, does it work, and what lessons can we learn. A couple of questions. One is obviously the key thing is long-term sustainability of any finance mechanism, I think. And who are you looking for to get this funded for, like long-term? Is it like local in-country businesses or more international level organizations? Also linked to that is the issue of empowerment of the communities. Because normally I do a lot of social and economic research, and a lot of the time we want to involve the community somehow, even if they pay towards the premiums a minimal amount, but they're empowered in that way and they really understand how the system works. So just curious if that is how are you including the communities? And another question is, maybe it's too early to know, but can you say anything about what locations are best for implementing parametric insurance?
Okay. So I think for the first question, you were talking about who would be the potential, like in terms of sustainability. I think it comes in phases. So I think I mentioned earlier that for the pilot, we usually go to the governments. I think was it you, Matt, who were saying that most of the funding comes from the government. So at least at this stage where the model is still in its testing phase, we're trying to build a proof of concept. Government is the usual source of funding. But definitely after we have seen, because the stakeholders have yet to see if payouts are actually made. So once they have seen that payouts are actually made in an event of a trigger, then that will increase their interest or increase their confidence. They can actually invest in these types of products. So we are looking at, when we did a regulatory analysis, there are several players that can come to play. Government, and of course businesses could also form part of the one who's going to pay for the insurance. But a lot of times it's mostly public-private partnerships. So the government can actually pay, for instance, the government can pay for the premium, But the insurers are actually private entities. So we're looking at national, local insurers. At the same time, we are also trying to transfer the risk to the international market. So we are ceding or transferring a portion of the risk to international insurance companies. So yeah, a little bit a mix of both. Then the second would be in terms of, what was it? Is it the community? Yeah.
Where do you think, like, what criteria have you found that is best for implementing parametric insurance? Because obviously all these finance mechanisms, they can work in some places and not others. So can you give any idea of where it's good to implement this?
Essentially, I think there is increased interest now in where the risks are actually apparent. And then there are certain parameters. Does this particular potential site, does this have enough historical data for the insurers to actually predict the likelihood of occurrence of a particular lease and even the scope of the risk? So those are things. And I think your second question was really more of how do we engage with the communities. So there is, of course, really an important education component to this program, because essentially at the end of the day, we want them to really see the value of the ecosystem services provided by this ecosystem. So there's a strong education component to the project as well.
All right.
Here? I'm sorry, Diane, again for you.
One final question.
Well, one to these guys, there's one, the first part.
Oh no, there's a new limit.
Okay, it's just
question.
one. Just take this as one. I would like to understand how it differs, the parametric insurance. If I'm sick, I get a flu, I don't go to work, insurance covers for that day. So that triggered, so it's kind of already a parametric insurance, correct?
Not
wait,
necessarily.
wait, just because the question didn't finish. Sorry. Also, because I'm working with potential polluting wrecks, as they still hold a lot of these tanks from Second World War, a lot of TNT and fuel. We know they were going to bring this out eventually on a storm or a tsunami, or just the tanks will rust. So the point is you're going to lose potentially an entire livelihood on a specific place. Can I use this as a potential polluting wreck being assured by parametric insurance, meaning that the oil spill will occur? So in that case, this will trigger insurance to cover for liabilities within a coastline? It was just one question.
So there are different parameters. Oil spills or weather or even drought could really be parameters for payout. So it's really predefined between the policyholder and also the insurance policyholder and even the calculation agent. So there are a lot of players in play. So even for oil spills, maybe the level of oil spills, they do not really have to go there and assess the value, because assessment itself will be costly. So there are some pre-agreed parameters in terms of the level of oil spill that payouts can actually be triggered even without them physically visiting the area. So for the flu or something, so it's not parametric because for health, you will actually have to be assessed to ensure that it's actually the extent of your disease before you're paid. So I think in terms of health, parametric won't be applicable. I hope that I answered your question, but maybe we can talk more after.
We'll talk more. Thank you.
Yeah.
You can. All right. We've covered a fair bit of ground this morning, but that is that. So please join me in thanking all of the speakers from this last session.